The air over the shattered Italian countryside in the spring of 1944 was a familiar, lethal cocktail of cordite, engine oil, and the thin, biting cold of high altitude. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, a veteran of the Eastern Front and now a squadron leader in Jagdgeschwader 77, this sky was his office, his sanctuary, and his hunting ground. From the tight confines of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G's cockpit, the world was a starkly beautiful panorama of sun-drenched Apennine peaks and the distant, shimmering azure of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Below, the relentless Allied advance was a crawling, muddy scar upon the landscape, a problem for the Wehrmacht. His problem, however, was in the air. His targets were the lumbering silver beasts, the American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators that swarmed from their bases in Foggia, their formations so vast they blotted out the Sunday. He and his men were the falcons, tasked with plunging into these flocks of steel sheep and tearing them from the sky. Klaus was a product of the Reich's finest training. He understood aerial combat as a brutal, three-dimensional chess match. He knew the strengths of his Gustav, its powerful cannon, its climbing ability. He knew the weaknesses of the American bombers, the vulnerable spots just behind the wing route, the way a well-placed burst could ignite a fuel line and turn the 10-man crew into a funeral pyre. He also knew their protectors, the P-47 Thunderbolt, a brutish, heavy-fisted brawler, the elegant but fragile P-38 Lightning, and the most feared of all, the P-51 Mustang, a long-range killer that had changed the very nature of the air war over Europe. He respected the pilots of these machines. They were aggressive, well-equipped, and seemingly endless in number. He had fought them, he had shot some of them down, and some of his friends had been shot down by them. It was a war of professionals, a deadly fraternity. But today, something was different. His squadron had been vectored towards a massive bomber stream, heading for the marshalling yards at Anzio. The familiar chatter of his wingmen crackled in his ears as they climbed to intercept, the sun at their backs. As they closed the distance, the formation came into view, a sprawling city of wings and contrails, and with them the escort, Mustangs. But as Klaus squinted against the glare, a detail snagged his attention, a flicker of color that didn't belong. The tails. The tails of the Mustangs flying top cover, a tight, disciplined weave above the bombers, were painted a solid, garish red. He'd never seen this before. A new unit, perhaps? Green pilots fresh from the States, eager to make a name for themselves, his lips curled into a half-smile. Green pilots made mistakes. He signaled his men to form up for a classic roller coaster attack. They would dive from above, slash through the escort, and pour cannon fire into the bombers before the Americans could react. It was a maneuver they had practiced to perfection. Klaus rolled his 109 over, the earth and sky swapping places, and began his plunge. He picked out his target, the lead B-24 of the lowest squadron. The red-tailed Mustangs saw them coming, of course. Two of them detached from the main group and turned to meet him, climbing hard. Predictable. Klaus ignored them, knowing his wingmen would engage, tying them up while he went for the prize. He centered the bomber in his gun sight, the range closing rapidly. 500 meters. 400. His thumb hovered over the firing stud. Then, his world erupted. It wasn't the clumsy, desperate spray of a rookie. It was a clinical, precise burst of .50 caliber fire that stitched a perfectly straight line just off his port wing. It was so close he felt the vibration through his airframe. He broke hard, yanking the stick back and to the right, his body crushed by the G-forces. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the attacker flash past, a red-tailed Mustang. It hadn't come from the pair that rose to meet him. It had come from somewhere else, somewhere he hadn't looked, flown by a pilot who understood energy and angles with a terrifying clarity. The American pilot didn't try to turn and burn. He used his speed to climb back up, rejoining the escort formation as if nothing had happened. It was a display of utter, calculated discipline. Klaus cursed, his heart pounding. The attack was spoiled. The entire squadron, seeing their leader forced onto the defensive, hesitated. The window of opportunity was gone. They were forced to skirmish with the red-tailed escorts, who refused to be drawn away from their charges. They stuck to the bombers like glue, their movements economical, their gunnery lethally accurate. They didn't chase glory, they simply built an impenetrable wall of steel between the Luftwaffe and the bombers. Klaus and his men, low on fuel, were forced to break off, leaving the bomber stream to drone on towards its target, untouched. As he flew back to base, the sun glinting off the strange red tails in the distance, Klaus Richter couldn't shake a profound sense of unease. It wasn't just that he had been beaten. It was how he had been beaten. The cold, unnerving professionalism was shocking, and he was left with a question that buzzed louder than his engine. Who were these pilots? To understand why a simple coat of red paint on an airplane's tail could cause such existential shock, one must first understand the world Klaus Richter and every other German soldier inhabited. It was a world built on a meticulously constructed pyramid of lies, a universe defined by the absolute certainty of racial hierarchy. From the moment a German child could read, they were inundated with the teachings of National Socialism. They were the Herrenvolk, the master race, a people of poets, engineers and warriors destined to rule. Their superiority was, they were told, a biological fact, as certain as the laws of physics. All other peoples were arranged on a descending scale of value beneath them. The British were stubborn merchants, the French were decadent, the Russians were a Slavic horde, but at the very bottom of this scale, barely even considered human, were black people. The propaganda machine of Joseph Goebbels portrayed black people, and specifically black Americans, as subhuman or Untermenschen. They were depicted in posters and films as lazy, unintelligent, brutish creatures, capable only of manual labor, music, and dance. The very idea that such a person could master the immense complexities of modern aerial combat, the physics of flight, the mechanics of a supercharged engine, the geometry of deflection shooting, the iron discipline of formation flying was not just unlikely, it was considered a laughable impossibility. It was a biological absurdity. America itself was portrayed as a mongrel nation, a chaotic mix of races that had diluted its European stock and sapped its strength. It was a nation of gangsters and jazz musicians, a culture so shallow and commercialized that it could never produce warriors with the spirit and conviction of the German soldier. When the Reich declared war on the United States, Hitler himself had openly mocked America's industrial and military potential, viewing it as a degenerate nation incapable of waging a serious war. German military intelligence reports often contained this racial bias, underestimating American capabilities based on the assumption that a multicultural society was inherently weak and fractured. Therefore, for a pilot like Klaus Richter, the enemy in the P-51 was a known quantity, a white American, likely of British or German descent, a professional he could respect as an equal, even as he tried to kill him. The pilot of that red-tailed Mustang, however, represented a crack in the foundation of his entire worldview. He couldn't have known, but the man who had so thoroughly outflown him was not the enemy he had been trained to fight. He was the enemy he had been taught could not exist. Across the Atlantic, in a nation grappling with its own profound sins, a reality was being forged that would shatter this Nazi ideology. The genesis of the Tuskegee Airmen was not born from a place of enlightened progress, but from immense political pressure and a deeply ingrained hypocrisy. America was fighting a war for freedom and democracy abroad, while denying those very same principles to millions of its own citizens at home. For decades, African Americans had been systematically barred from the cockpits of military aircraft. The prevailing wisdom, codified in a racist 1925 Army War College study, was that they were unfit for combat, lacking the intelligence, courage, and mechanical aptitude to serve as pilots. But civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the Black Press waged a relentless campaign, demanding the right to fight and die for their country on equal terms. This movement was crystallized in the WWII campaign: victory against fascism overseas and victory against racism at home. Bowing to this pressure, the Roosevelt administration authorized the creation of a segregated training program for black pilots at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. It was, from the start, an experiment designed by many in the War Department to fail. The cadets were given substandard equipment, faced constant harassment, and were held to a standard far more rigorous than their white counterparts. Every mistake was magnified. every failure seen as proof of their supposed inferiority. Yet, this intense pressure cooker did not break them. It forged them into something extraordinary. Under the stern leadership of Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a West Point graduate who endured 4 years of silent, ostracizing treatment from his white classmates, the men of the 332nd Fighter Group cultivated an iron discipline. They knew they weren't just flying for themselves, or even for their country in the abstract. They were flying for the future of their entire race. They carried the weight of 13 million African Americans on their wings. This immense burden created a unique, unspoken tactical doctrine. While many fighter groups in Europe celebrated their aces, rewarding pilots for the number of enemy planes they shot down, the Tuskegee Airmen adopted a different creed. Their primary mission was not to hunt for glory, it was to protect the bombers. They understood that every B-17 or B-24 that made it back to base was a victory, saving 10 American lives and bringing the war one day closer to its end. This led to their famous, almost mythical motto: never lose a bomber. They would stick to their little friends, as they called the bombers, weaving a protective shield around them, fighting only when engaged and refusing to be lured away by the promise of an easy kill. It was a strategy born of supreme discipline and a profound sense of collective responsibility. It was this ethos, forged in the fires of American prejudice, that was about to collide with the arrogant certainty of the Nazi master race in the skies over Europe. Klaus Richter hadn't just been outflown, he had encountered a force whose motivation and purpose he couldn't possibly comprehend. The rumors began as whispers in the smoky mess halls of Luftwaffe airfields scattered across northern Italy. They were at first dismissed as latrine gossip, the kind of fantastical stories that bubble up from the stress of combat. A pilot from another Geschwader, his arm in a sling and his eyes still wide with the phantom terror of a near-fatal spin, would swear he'd been jumped by Mustangs with bright red tails. When pressed for details, he'd mutter something about how they flew, how they stuck to the bombers, how they seemed to appear from nowhere. The stories were inconsistent, but the detail of the red tails remained a constant, unsettling thread. At first, the men of Jagerschwader 77 laughed it off. Young Lieutenant Franz Stigler, a cocky Bavarian with a row of kill markings already gracing his rudder, found it particularly amusing. Red tails, he scoffed one evening, swirling a glass of cheap Italian brandy. It's a circus. The Americans are sending clowns to fight us now. What's next? Pilots with painted faces and floppy shoes. His comrades laughed along with him. The idea was preposterous. It had to be a propaganda move, a desperate attempt by the Americans to intimidate them with garish colors because their pilots lacked skill. Then, intelligence officers, with their usual air of detached seriousness, confirmed a piece of the rumor. A new, all-black fighter squadron, the 332nd Fighter Group, was now operational in the theater. The laughter in the mess hall that night was louder, more brittle, tinged with a cruel, swaggering arrogance. The concept was beyond comical. It was an insult. They, the inheritors of the legacy of Richthofen and Bolke, the Knights of the Air, were to be challenged by men they had been taught since childhood were racially incapable of operating a complex machine like a fighter plane. Imagine the headlines, Franz bellowed, slamming his glass on the wooden table. Franz Stigler shoots down 3. What do we even call them? In one sortie, they'll give me a Knight's Cross for this turkey shoot. The consensus was clear. This was a gift. The Americans, in their decadent, race-mixing foolishness, had handed the Luftwaffe a squadron of easy victories. Every pilot in the squadron dreamed of being the first to encounter the red-tailed Mustangs, to claim a kill that would be not just a number, but a joke to be told for years to come. They were confident, they were arrogant, and they were about to fly headlong into a buzzsaw. The target for August 24th, 1944, was the Blechhammer synthetic oil refinery in Silesia, deep inside territory defended by the Reich's most formidable air units. It was a mission the bomber crews dreaded. To reach it, the 15th Air Force's bomber streams had to fly a long, perilous route over heavily defended territory. For the Luftwaffe, it was a golden opportunity. The High Command assembled a massive force, a Gefechtsverband of over 300 fighters, combining Bf-109 seconds and the heavily armed Focke-Wulf Flaf 190 seconds, including the fearsome Sturmbucker Fwo 190 seconds laden with extra armor and cannons designed to tear a bomber apart with a single pass. The German plan was a masterpiece of coordinated aerial assault. Wave after wave would hit the bomber formation, overwhelming the escorts through sheer numbers and firepower. Klaus Richter, leading an element of the attack, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. This would be a great and terrible day. This would be a slaughter. As they climbed towards the approaching bomber stream, the German formations were a picture of Teutonic power. They spotted the escorts, a distant swarm of silver specks. And then they saw them, flying top cover, positioned perfectly between the German fighters and the bombers, was a group of Mustangs. Their tails were painted a defiant, blood red. In the German cockpits, radios crackled with excited, mocking chatter. "Look, Klaus, the circus is in town." It was Franz. "Save one for me!" The German commanders gave the order to attack. The assault began like an avalanche. The heavily armed Floff 190 seconds charged head-on into the bombers, cannons blazing, while the more nimble Ploff 109 seconds, including Klaus's squadron, swept down to engage the escort, intending to tie them up and drag them away from their charges. This was the moment Franz had been waiting for. He peeled off, screaming down towards a lone red-tailed Mustang, seeing his Knight's Cross glinting in the sunday. He couldn't believe his luck. The American pilot seemed to see him late, making a slow, clumsy-looking turn, an amateur. Franz lined him up in his sights, his finger tightening on the trigger. What happened next was not a dogfight. It was an execution. Before Franz could fire, his cockpit exploded in a shower of shattered plexiglass and screeching metal. 50 caliber rounds, fired from a second Mustang he had never even seen, tore through his engine and fuselage. His plane, which a moment before was a finely tuned instrument of death, was now a plume of smoke and fire. He had flown directly into a textbook trap, a perfectly executed defensive split. All across the sky, the same scene was repeating with nightmarish clarity. The Germans were stunned. The red-tailed pilots refused to be drawn into individual dogfights. They fought with a terrifying disciplined fury, operating in pairs and elements of four. When a German fighter dove on a Mustang, its wingman would immediately drop onto the German's tail. They communicated seamlessly, creating overlapping fields of fire. They didn't chase after fleeing 109 seconds. The moment a German fighter broke off the attack, the red tails would let them go, immediately returning to their close escort position around the bombers. Their discipline was inhuman. They had one job: protect the bombers, and they were doing it with a lethal focus that the Luftwaffe pilots had never encountered before. Klaus Richter found himself in a swirling melee, fighting for his life against two of them. They worked in perfect concert, one forcing him to break, while the other positioned for a shot. He was one of the Luftwaffe's best, a veteran of 100 dogfights, and he was being completely, utterly outclassed. He saw Focke-Wulfs, their noses bristling with cannons, being systematically picked apart by these red-tailed predators. He saw Bf 109 seconds tumbling out of the sky in flames. The confident assault had devolved into a desperate, chaotic scramble for survival. The radios, once filled with arrogant jokes, were now a cacophony of panicked screams and cries for help. "I'm hit! I'm hit! He's on my tail! Get him off me!" Where did he come from? The Luftwaffe's grand, coordinated attack was shattered. They had thrown their best against the circus clowns, and they were being systematically dismantled. Battered and bleeding, their formations broken, the surviving German pilots disengaged, streaking for home, leaving the bomber stream, impossibly, to fly on. Not a single bomber escorted by the 332nd Fighter Group was lost to enemy fighters that day. The return to base was a grim, silent affair. Ground crews rushed to planes riddled with bullet holes. The empty hardstands where pilots like Franz Stigler should have been parked were like open graves. In the debriefing room, the swagger was gone. Men sat slumped on benches, their faces pale with shock, some trembling uncontrollably. They had faced the best of the RAF, the VVS, and the USAAF, but they had never experienced anything like this. It wasn't just the loss of pilots and planes, it was the psychological devastation, the complete demolition of a core belief. These red-tail pilots were not just good, they were brilliant. They were disciplined, courageous, and deadly. The Germans couldn't reconcile the reality of what they had just witnessed with the propaganda they had been fed their entire lives. How could a people they considered subhuman produce warriors of this caliber? The shock was profound, a deep, cognitive dissonance that left them shaken and confused. The mockery was replaced by a new, chilling name, spoken in hushed and fearful tones. They weren't circus clowns, they were the Schwarz-Teufel, the Black Devils. And in the minds of the Luftwaffe pilots who survived that day, the sight of a red tail on a P-51 Mustang was no longer a joke. It was a death warrant. The shock of that first encounter over Blechhammer was not an isolated incident. It was a seismic event that sent tremors through the entire Luftwaffe command structure in the Mediterranean theatre. The initial reports were met with disbelief, even ridicule, by staff officers far from the front. They were dismissed as the exaggerated accounts of shaken pilots, or perhaps an anomaly, a single lucky engagement. But the new reality could not be denied for long, because the anomaly began to repeat itself with relentless, terrifying frequency. The red tails were not a fluke, they were a system, and the system worked. In the briefing rooms of the 15th Air Force bomber groups, a similar transformation was taking place. The bomber crews, young men from every corner of America, were not immune to the prejudices of their time. They had heard the same jokes, held the same doubts. When they were first told that a black fighter group would be escorting them, there was apprehension. Their lives were on the line, and they wanted the best pilots protecting them, not some political experiment. Their doubts evaporated in the crucible of combat. The bomber crews, flying their 10-hour missions into the heart of hell, began to notice something remarkable. On the days they were escorted by other groups, they would see dogfights rage across the sky, escorts peeling off to chase German fighters. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. They would see their little friends get picked off by determined attackers who broke through the screen. But when they looked out of their waist gunner positions or through the plexiglass nose of their B-24 and saw the distinctive red tails flying a tight, disciplined formation around them, a sense of calm would settle over the crew. The red tails didn't leave. They never strayed. They were a shield, a constant, reassuring presence. Word spread like wildfire through the bomber bases. If you see the red tails, you know you're making it home. They stopped being that black squadron and became something else entirely. They became the Red Tail Angels. The bomber commanders, men who cared only for results and the lives of their crews, began specifically requesting the 332nd Fighter Group for the most dangerous missions, the deep penetration raids into the most heavily defended targets. The experiment was over. The 332nd had become the gold standard, the elite. Their disciplined, close escort doctrine was no longer just their internal motto. It was now recognized as the most effective bomber protection strategy in the theater, a systematic approach to air warfare that was saving American lives and crushing the enemy's will to fight. One of the most powerful symbols of German industrial and military might was its capital, Berlin. By the spring of 1945, the city was a fortress, ringed by the most concentrated anti-aircraft defenses the world had ever seen, and protected by the last of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, including the new jet squadrons. A daylight raid on Berlin was a suicide mission for any bomber crew, and for the escort fighters it was the ultimate test, a 1,600-mile round trip that pushed their P-51 Mustangs to the absolute limit of their range. On March 24, 1945, the 15th Air Force launched its longest and most audacious raid of the war, a massive strike against the Daimler-Benz tank factory in the heart of the city. The mission was assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group. For the German High Command, this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. Their intelligence knew the range of the P-51. They calculated that by the time the bomber stream reached the target, the American escorts would be dangerously low on fuel, forced to turn back, leaving the bombers helpless. To deliver the killing blow, they had held their trump card in reserve. The Messerschmitt Me-260. 2. The world's first operational jet fighter. It was a machine that seemed to come from the future. Nearly 120 miles per hour faster than the Mustang, armed with 4 devastating 30mm cannons. The German jet pilots, the cream of the crop, were supremely confident. Against the piston-engine American fighters, it wouldn't be a fair fight. It would be a slaughter. As the B-17 seconds approached the target, the German jet pilots of Jagdgeschwader 7 climbed into their futuristic cockpits. Their commander, the legendary ace Adolf Galland, had assembled them for this moment. They were the Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons that would sweep the Allied air forces from the sky and turn the tide of the war. They took off, rocketing into the sky with a sound no Allied pilot had ever heard before, a high-pitched, banshee scream. They leveled off at 30,000 feet and streaked towards the bomber formation, anticipating the sight of unprotected fortresses ripe for the kill. Instead, what they saw stunned them into silence. There, flying a serene, perfect escort pattern above the bombers, was a sea of P-51 seconds, and on their tails, gleaming in the cold March sun over Berlin, was a defiant, impossible red. The red tails were still there. They had somehow managed their fuel to perfection, flying the last leg of the journey on fumes, determined not to leave their charges. The German jet pilots couldn't believe their eyes, but shock quickly gave way to arrogance. It didn't matter. A propeller plane was a propeller plane, and Me-262 could slice through them like a shark through a school of minnows. A flight of jets dove on the bombers, their cannons spitting fire. But the red-tail pilots, led by Colonel Benjamin O. Davis himself, had studied the intelligence reports on the new jets. They knew they couldn't outrun them, but they also knew the jets were less maneuverable and that their pilots were still learning the new tactics of jet combat. Instead of scattering, the red tails turned into the attack. What followed was a clash between two eras of aviation. The Tuskegee Airmen used their superior turning ability and classic dogfighting tactics, forcing the German pilots into mistakes. In the skies over the Reich's capital, the supposedly inferior pilots in their obsolete propeller planes did the impossible. They shot down 3 of the futuristic Me-262 jets. The German pilots, who had expected an easy massacre, were utterly routed, fleeing in disbelief. For them, it was a moment of profound psychological collapse. If their wonder weapons, flown by their best aces, could be defeated by these pilots, then what hope was left? That day, the Red-Tail Angels escorted the bombers to Berlin and back, and not a single one was lost to an enemy fighter. This pattern of shocked disbelief was not confined to the skies over Germany. In the oil fields of Ploiești, Romania, one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe, German and Romanian flak gunners had grown accustomed to a grim spectacle. The sky above them was a permanent shooting gallery, a lethal curtain of black puffs from their 88mm guns. They were used to seeing American liberators, wings sheared off, engines on fire, spiraling down into the oil refineries they had come to destroy. It was a routine, a predictable consequence of flying into the hornet's nest. Then, one day, the routine was broken. A bomber stream appeared, but this time it was different. It was encased in a protective bubble of fighters with red tails. These escorts flew through the densest flak with an unnerving calm, never wavering, never breaking formation. The Luftwaffe fighters that rose to intercept them were met with a wall of disciplined firepower. The German pilots, used to feasting on bombers that strayed from the herd, found no stragglers. The red tails kept the formation so tight that there were no openings. The flak gunners on the ground kept firing, but the sky did not rain bombers as it usually did. The stream flew through the inferno, dropped its bombs, and flew out, still protected by its relentless red-tailed guardians. On the ground, the gunners and pilots were left to stare at an empty sky, bewildered. The predictable slaughter had not occurred. The red-tail angels had flown through hell itself and brought their charges home. The symbol of the red tail was no longer just a unit marking. For the American bomber crews, the sight of that flash of color meant hope. It meant survival. It was the cavalry coming over the hill. For the Luftwaffe, it had been transformed from a joke into an omen. A red tail meant you were about to face an opponent who would not make a mistake, who would not be lured away, and who would fight with a skill and discipline that was as terrifying as it was inexplicable. The glint of the sun off that painted rudder became a symbol of a new reality, a reality where the old lies of racial superiority were being shot out of the sky, one burning Messerschmitt at a time. In the carpeted, smoke-filled offices of the Luftwaffe II headquarters, the daily after-action reports from the fighter wings were no longer a source of pride, but of growing alarm. The teletype machines chattered relentlessly, spitting out long strips of paper that detailed fuel states, ammunition expenditures, and, most grimly, casualty lists. For months, a disturbing pattern had been emerging, a statistical anomaly so consistent it could no longer be ignored. On days when American bomber streams were escorted by P-51 seconds from the 306th or 52nd Fighter Groups, the Luftwaffe could expect a certain exchange ratio. They would lose planes, but they would almost always down a few bombers. It was a brutal attritional calculus, but one that was understood. However, on days when the target was escorted by the 332nd Fighter Group, referred to in the German reports simply by their visual identifier, the Roten Schwenzer, or red tails, the numbers were starkly, maddeningly different. The German losses would often be higher, and the bomber losses were frequently, impossibly, zero. At first, the generals and staff officers in their immaculate grey uniforms dismissed the data. They blamed the pilots. The men were young, inexperienced, exhausted from years of non-stop fighting on multiple fronts. Perhaps they were losing their nerve. Perhaps their claims were exaggerated. But the reports kept coming, from different squadrons, different commanders, all telling the same story. Aces with dozens of kills on their rudders were returning to base, their planes shot to pieces, swearing that they had been ambushed and outfought by these red-tailed fighters who simply refused to leave the bombers. The High Command was faced with an uncomfortable truth that defied their entire ideological framework. They had a tactical problem, a serious one, and it had a bright red tail. A special intelligence analysis was commissioned. The resulting dossier was a clinical, dispassionate document, stripped of the crude racial caricatures of the propaganda ministry. It detailed the tactics of the 332nd, their disciplined formation flying, their refusal to be lured away from their charges, their uncanny ability to work in teams, and their lethal gunnery. The conclusion was chilling. The Roten Schwenzer Group was not just another American fighter unit. They were, tactically speaking, the most effective bomber escort group operating in the entire theater. The realization sent a quiet shockwave through the command structure. The joke was over. This circus had become their most dangerous adversary. In response, German tacticians did what they did best. They engineered a more powerful, more brutal solution. If single squadrons were failing, they would attack with an entire wing. They refined the Gefechtsverband concept, creating a massive, armoured fist designed to smash through any escort screen. The plan was terrifying in its logic. The first wave would be comprised of the FWAS 190 Sturmbucker. These were not fighters. They were flying battering rams, their wings reinforced, their cockpits lined with extra armour plating, and their guns replaced with heavy 30mm cannons that could obliterate a bomber with a handful of shells. The Sturmbucker pilots were often ordered to press their attacks to the point of ramming if necessary. Their sole purpose was to charge head-on into the bomber formations, ignore the escorts, and break the bombers' defensive cohesion. The theory was that the American escort pilots, seeing their little friends being savaged, would instinctively panic and dive into the fray, abandoning their high-cover positions. At that moment, the second wave of German fighters, hundreds of lighter, more agile Blef 109 seconds lurking high above, would plunge down on the now disorganized American escorts, slaughtering them in a one-sided battle. It was a brilliant, ruthless plan, and against almost any other fighter group, it would have worked. When the Luftwaffe first unleashed this tactic against a bomber stream escorted by the Red Tails, The German pilots were certain of victory. They watched as the armoured FOI 192nd began their head-on charge. They saw the red-tailed Mustangs turn to meet them. "Here it comes," the German flight leaders murmured into their radios, anticipating the American escorts would break formation and be drawn down into the chaos. But the red tails did not break. In a display of almost unbelievable nerve, they met the heavily armed Sturmbucker head-on, flying directly into the face of the 30mm cannons. They didn't scatter. They focused their fire, picking off the fly 192nd one by one, disrupting the charge before it could ever reach the bombers. Above them, the pilots in the second wave of Bf 109 watched in stunned disbelief. Their trap had failed to spring. The red tails refused the bait. They fulfilled their primary objective, neutralizing the immediate threat to the bombers, and then climbed back into their escort positions, a disciplined, impenetrable shield. The German plan, so carefully constructed, had completely unraveled. It was predicated on a specific psychological reaction from the American pilots, a reaction the Tuskegee Airmen simply refused to have. Their discipline was a weapon more powerful than any German cannon. The failure of these desperate countermeasures marked a turning point. The Luftwaffe was running out of ideas. They had thrown their heaviest armour and their most ruthless tactics at the red tails, and it had shattered against a wall of unbreakable discipline. For the average pilot like Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, the war in the air had transformed into a private nightmare. The sky, once his domain, now felt alien and hostile. The briefings, which used to be confident tactical discussions, now included specific, ominous warnings about the operational zone of the 332nd. Flight surgeons noticed a sharp increase in combat fatigue among the pilots of Jägergeschwader 77. Men who had unflinchingly faced swarms of Soviet fighters over the Kuban bridgehead were now developing nervous tremors at the thought of another mission over Italy. The psychological impact was devastating because it struck at the very heart of their identity as warriors of the master race. They were supposed to be superior. It was a fact, a law of nature they had been taught since they were boys. Yet every encounter with the red tails was a brutal refutation of that law. It wasn't just that they were being beaten, it was who was beating them. To be outflown by a white American was a professional defeat. To be systematically dismantled by a black American was an existential one. It implied that everything they had been told, everything they were fighting and dying for, was a lie. This cognitive dissonance began to manifest as a corrosive, unspoken fear. The sight of a red tail in the distance was enough to make a veteran pilot's blood run cold. They knew what was coming, a flawless, coordinated attack from which there was often no escape. A quiet fatalism crept into the mess halls and barracks. Pilots stopped boasting of future victories and instead wrote long, somber letters home. Some began to find excuses not to fly. An engine that was running slightly rough, a radio that was supposedly malfunctioning any small problem, became a legitimate reason to abort a mission rather than face the red tails. It was a subtle, creeping decay of morale that no amount of patriotic speeches from Berlin could fix. The enemy was no longer just the American Air Force. It was a specific, terrifying entity symbolized by a patch of red paint. The red tails had done more than just shoot down their planes. They had shot down their certainty. They had broken their spirit. For Klaus Richter and the dwindling number of pilots left in his squadron, the war was already lost. They might continue to fly, to fight, to follow orders, but the swaggering confidence of the Herrenvolk was gone forever, replaced by the grim, hollow-eyed resignation of men who knew they were not just being defeated, but were being proven fundamentally, terribly wrong. The end came not with a single thunderous bang, but with the grinding, agonizing screech of a vast machine tearing itself apart. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was a hollowed-out carcass, its cities pulverized into seas of grey rubble, its armies collapsing on all fronts. For the German people and the soldiers who had fought for them, the overwhelming question was not if the war was lost, but how the defeat could have been so absolute, so crushingly total. They had been assured of their innate superiority, their martial prowess, their destiny to rule for 1,000 years. How had it all come to this? The answer was not simply found in the number of tanks that poured from Soviet factories or the tonnage of bombs that fell from Allied planes. The final verdict on the war was a verdict on two fundamentally opposing worldviews, and the skies over Europe had been the ultimate courtroom. The American war machine that ultimately crushed the Axis was a testament to a philosophy the Nazi mind could never comprehend. Germany's strength was built on a principle of exclusion, the idea of a pure, homogeneous master race, which by its very definition limited its pool of talent and manpower. America, for all its profound and violent hypocrisies, drew its strength from the opposite principle. It was a messy, chaotic, and often unjust amalgamation of peoples, but within that chaos lay a vast, untapped reservoir of human potential. The P-51 Mustang itself was a symbol of this, a design collaboration between an American company and a British engine manufacturer, a hybrid creation of staggering genius. But the true American industrial miracle wasn't just the mass production of these superlative aircraft, it was the mass production of the men who flew them. The Tuskegee Airmen were the ultimate embodiment of this. They were a resource that Nazi ideology would have discarded as worthless, a pool of talent that a racially exclusive system was blind to. The American system, forced by political pressure and the demands of war, grudgingly opened a door that had been sealed by prejudice, and in doing so, unleashed a force that would help seal the Reich's doom. The program that began as a political experiment designed to fail had become one of the most potent weapons in the American arsenal, proving that the true strength of a nation lay not in its racial purity, but in its capacity to draw upon the courage and skill of all its citizens. This moral victory was written not in philosophical treatises, but in the cold, hard numbers of combat reports. As the war drew to a close, and the statisticians of the USAAF began to compile the final tallies, a single, unbelievable fact emerged from the data. It was a number that, at first, seemed like a clerical error, a misprint that had to be double-checked, then triple-checked. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group had flown over 1,500 missions across all their squadrons. They had completed 200 bomber escort missions, often deep into the most heavily defended territory in the world, places like Ploiești, Munich, and Berlin. They had faced down the best of the Luftwaffe's remaining aces. They had gone toe-to-toe with the futuristic Me-262 jets. They had earned over 150 distinguished flying crosses, legions of air medals, and a presidential unit citation for their legendary performance. They had destroyed or damaged over 400 enemy aircraft. These were astounding accomplishments by any measure, but it was the other number, or rather the lack of it, that solidified their legend and served as the final, irrefutable demonstration of their dominance. In all of those 200 bomber escort missions, through all that flak, through all those swirling dogfights against hundreds of enemy fighters, not a single American bomber under their direct protection was ever lost to enemy fighter aircraft. It was a perfect record, a statistical impossibility achieved in the most violent skies in human history. The men who had been deemed unfit to fly had achieved a level of perfection that no other fighter group could claim. Their motto, "Never lose a bomber," had not been a boast. It had been a sacred promise, and they had kept it. This single fact was the ultimate verdict. It was the final, devastating counter-argument to every lie Goebbels had ever spun, to every racist theory Hitler had ever preached. It was proof, written in the contrails of warplanes and paid for in blood and courage, that skill, discipline, and valor are not the property of any one race. The ultimate demonstration of American power was not an atomic bomb or a battleship. It was the quiet, unimpeachable perfection of the Red Tail Angel's record. In the summer of 1945, in a prisoner of war camp in the Allied-occupied zone, a former Luftwaffe Oberleutnant named Klaus Richter stared through the barbed wire at a clear, peaceful sky. The war was over. His uniform was tattered, his nation was in ruins, and his mind was a wasteland of broken certainties. One day, an American officer, a young man from the War Records Division, was interviewing the German pilots, gathering intelligence for historical analysis. he asked Klaus about his experiences fighting the various American fighter groups. Klaus spoke of the Thunderbolts, the Lightnings, and the different Mustang groups. Then, hesitantly, he asked the American a question that had haunted him for over a year. "The Mustangs," he said in broken English, "the ones with the red tails. The Schwarz-Teufel. Who were they?" "They were different. Their discipline, I have never seen anything like it." The American officer looked down at his clipboard and then back at the gaunt German ace. "The 332nd Fighter Group," he said simply. "We called them the Tuskegee Airmen. They were all Negro pilots." Klaus Richter just stared. The words did not compute. He felt no anger, no hatred, just a profound, hollow emptiness. The feeling of a man whose entire world has just dissolved into dust. The pilots who had outflown him, who had shattered his squadron, who had haunted his dreams with their inhuman discipline, the men he had come to respect and fear more than any other adversary, were the very people his ideology had placed at the bottom of humanity. In that moment, he understood the depth of the Reich's defeat. They had not merely been outfought or outproduced. They had been wrong. Their entire worldview was a fragile, pathetic lie, and that lie had been exposed and shot down in flames by the men they had laughed at. He looked up again at the empty blue sky, a sky that was once his kingdom. The roar of the engines was gone, replaced by a devastating silence. And in that silence, he could finally see the truth. The glint of the sun off a distant, blood-red tail had not just been a warning of an approaching enemy. It had been the glint of a new reality, a truth that had been forged in the fires of prejudice and proven in the crucible of war. A truth that would long outlast the 1,000-year Reich that had been too blind to see it.